Nicole, thanks for letting people in from the waiting room. I know they were getting antsy to participate, and we will refresh our supplies of e-donuts and e-coffee. You know, that's our commitment to this group in the course of this presentation. I want to thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's eCafe. My name is Anthony Bloom. I'm the Executive Director of the mEducation Alliance. I'm delighted to be joined by my fellow colleagues at the mEducation Alliance, Nicole Carney. Wave hello, Nicole. Hello. And our colleague Scott Isbrand. And we love doing this series just as our own informal dialogue with leading lights in the ed tech world. And we're really thrilled today to have three representatives from Learning Equality to talk about their terrific work that they've been doing around the world for a number of years. And we've been pleased to have Learning Equality at many of our prior events, symposia events, and other occasions as well. So we're going to start with Lauren Lickman, who's the partnerships lead at Learning Equality, and then bring in Shivi Chandra, the global curriculum specialist, and Vahid Masroor, the curriculum operations specialist at Learning Equality, to tell us about their great work. Before we get into the actual presentation as well, a few ground rules, one of which is this is an informal dialogue. Our friends from Learning Equality have prepared some background slides, which is terrific, but feel free to use the chat to ask questions as we go along. We're going to make ample space and opportunity to be able to have dialogue with those that are joining us today. So feel free to use the chat or save your questions as appropriate. For those that have attended our eCafe series, a number of them are posted through the mEducation Alliance website. We did host a month or so ago another terrific organization working on open education, Mathagon, based in the UK, and we'll be indicating when that presentation will be available through our e-news. If you don't already subscribe to our e-news, maybe Nicole or Scott, you could drop the link, or you could go to the mEducation Alliance website to be able to subscribe to the e-news. For upcoming events, we'll be doing an eCafe actually at the end of July with one of our new staff members on secondment from University in Canada, Scott Nicholson, who is going to be talking about escape games for education and working with us. We're so excited for a year. In fact, I think Scott may be joining us for today's session. So hopefully we'll get a chance. Perfect, Scott. Oh, there you go. And Scott, at the end of the event, I will just give you a chance to give a little bit of a preview of what you'll be talking about at the end of the July. So thanks for joining us today. For those of you that aren't aware, our annual symposium will be taking place in September, virtually again, as we did last year, from September 27th to 30th, the focus of which will be on ed tech for accelerating foundational literacy and numeracy in low resource settings. If you'd like to help us by circulating the call for presentation proposals, you could go to our website and go to the webpage. If you're interested in submitting a presentation proposal or know others that are, similarly, please invite them to submit. We were really excited about hosting our first large virtual event last year, something close to 900 registered participants, 80 presentations, 32 countries represented. We think this particular topic on foundational literacy and numeracy will be equally compelling. So I invite you to please let us know how you'd like to participate. Nicole or Scott, any other heads up before we turn to the formal program?
Nothing on my end, Tony. I'm just working on sharing the links that you mentioned, and welcome everyone to our eCafe. We're really happy that you joined us.
Okay, great. And thanks, Scott. Thanks for posting the link to the, or Nicole, the link to the e-news. All right. Well, Lauren, I wanted to start with just inviting you to provide some framing comments about Learning Equality, the terrific work that you're doing with Colibri, and then bringing in your colleagues. And we're really looking forward to today's presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to you. After your presentation, I'll have some general questions back and forth, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So Lauren.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tony, and the whole mEducation team for hosting this event today. I have my water, not my coffee or tea, unfortunately, but I hope everyone similarly has grabbed something virtual. So our team today is really excited to talk to you more about our organization, our open source product Colibri, and how we remix OERs and make them more practical for learning. Vahid, if you can advance the next few slides. This is our team. This is our team quickly. I'm Lauren, I lead our partnerships, and you'll soon be hearing from my colleagues Shivi and Vahid, who are on our content team. Coming in today's conversation, we were thinking about two guiding questions that we're hoping you can keep in mind as we give a little bit of overview of our organization and we thought would help to frame the discussion. The first is, how do you decide what makes OER relevant in a particular setting of use? What are important considerations or methods of evaluation? How do you really make them more practical, and what does that look like in the environments where you're working? And the second question is, then how would you evaluate when it makes sense to remix OERs, one of the 5 known Rs of OERs, or decide to supplement it with other materials or to create new ones? This is a question that we think about really often on our team, and so we're hoping to get some insights from you all and to help frame how we're thinking about use of OERs. As an organization, Vahid, to the next slide, learning equality sits at the intersection between quality relevant content and educational support tools, and the communities around the world who lack the connectivity to benefit from them. Everything that we do is driven by equity, and breaking down barriers that are preventing the most effective learning for the most marginalized is really where we focus in on. When we think about a lot of the infrastructural barriers that exist, this is like really where we put our focus. So our holistic approach addresses many of the limitations that I'm sure we're all familiar with in low resource learning environments that I think have been exacerbated during the pandemic. We develop solutions that are built for when internet connectivity is unreliable or hardware is minimal. We recognize that the limited availability and time for discovering openly available and locally developed learning resources can be a challenge. And we know that there's a need for an improved understanding of the pedagogical practices for blended learning, particularly for those with limited digital literacy skills. So our approach is that we build tech solutions to enrich learning for those without the internet, really focused on offline first development of technology, but then thinking about how we can create adaptable solutions that leverage what infrastructure already exists in terms of connectivity or hardware. And then from there, really narrow in on the different pedagogical approaches and how we can support relevant learning through different types of curricula, particularly leveraging OER. So we started with a product called K-Lite, which brought Khan Academy videos and exercises offline. And this approach has continued with Calibri, which we'll talk about today. Overall, we've really demonstrated that offline first learning works. We've reached millions of learners in our time doing this work. And our flexible and adaptable model combined with a combination of co-designing with strategic partners has really led to broad organic adoption and distribution of our products and tools. So that's what we're really excited to talk to you about today. In general, when we're talking to organizations who are thinking about leveraging education technology, regardless of whether it's Calibri, we're really thinking about 4 key questions. What existing infrastructure can be leveraged or supplemented, and I hope that that's kind of clear already when I talked about our approach. What learning resources are available for instruction, and can they be aligned or have they been aligned to national curricula? What's the potential for educator support, and what's their familiarity with tech? And lastly, what's the intended user journey for a student, educator, and administrator? And these kind of framing questions really help folks think through how they might begin to start planning for an education technology intervention. And with Calibri, which I'll turn over to Vahid in a second to talk more about, we've found a variety of blended learning pedagogical models and also different access models, depending upon what hardware exists, what content is available, the class sizes, and a variety of other parameters. So here are just some quick examples here, and we can dive more into it in Q&A if it's of interest, but I think today we're really excited to focus on OERs and how they're leveraged within those models. So I'll now turn it over to Vahid to talk more about Calibri, our open set of solutions. Over to Vahid, thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. So it's a pleasure to share this mEducation Cafe. And when we mention the use of, or when we discuss the use of Colibri, as Lauren mentioned, one of the highlights is definitely that it's been designed as an open solution, but also to offer first an offline centric solution, meaning we are looking at schools that might be remote or nonprofits that might be operating in areas that have low to no internet access, and how to provide them with the support they need to enrich school environments or learning environments in general. So this can happen in a variety of scenarios as we just saw. And in practical terms, what we are trying to get to offer is this curated learning library. And this means that we are looking at openly licensed educational contents that are available in a variety of languages, and usually are targeted at academic use, but also cover non-academic subject areas, and usually are focused on K-12, but might also include other contents for different types of users. And when we're discussing the implementation part of the learning environment we're trying to set or to facilitate, it's important to realize that the materials are modular, meaning that we are trying to facilitate a use that could draw from a variety of sources within our library. And then additional materials might also be uploaded by the users in different scenarios, and we can get into that later. But then a key part is that usually the partner organizations that are using Colibri will be looking at some way to align the contents, which might come from anywhere in the world, to a national curriculum. And then this means that the different sources don't stay intact as they would in a library. Rather, they can be used and adapted to the different needs on the ground. And so, as we mentioned that this is an offline first solution, it's important to realize that in an offline environment, we might need to distribute the materials to a variety of students, of teachers, of education actors that are participating in a project or an initiative. And then we have designed the tool to be easily copied and distributed around a small network that could be just a Wi-Fi network, or directly from a computer to a USB and into a tablet and so on, without need of infrastructure. And so this facilitates the distribution of materials at a very local scale with little to no external intervention. And so one thing that we have seen that needs more and more attention from educational initiatives is that these learners are working offline, but they also need to more and more be able to decide on the pace of their education. So we're looking at this idea of self-paced education. They might need to access materials that are on the library. They might need to choose on their own what kind of materials are fitting their needs. And so more and more we are designing or adapting the solution for that. But for the teacher, probably what is most useful is this idea that the educators, it might be a teacher in a school or a facilitator at a nonprofit. The question that the organizers always have is who is really reading the materials or benefiting from the videos or working with the exercises that we have selected and implemented in the lessons. And so through a Wi-Fi network, it's very easy for the facilitators of the educational initiative to look almost in real time at the interactions the students are having, and thus have a good grasp of what is going on in the classroom. And this can then allow for personalization of the work the students need to do. Since the teacher is able to see what their interactions with the materials are, they can then decide if supplemental materials are needed or which types of exercises would best fit a need. And so the next question is, well, how do we train the facilitators that will be implementing this educational initiative? So based on our years of experience of implementations with partners, we've developed a toolkit that facilitates the training for the trainers and is a resource for designing the implementations and then reflecting on those implementations. And with that, I will hand it over to Shivi, who will go in details with regards to what this remix of OERs can look like.
Thank you, Vahid. I am just going to quickly share my own screen for this segment, if everyone can see it. So thank you, everyone. I work alongside Vahid and Lauren on our content library, and I lead our content and curriculum strategy at Learning Equality. So one area which is always of interest to me as we're preparing materials and encouraging others to prepare materials for the system that Vahid just described and the way of engaging with content that Lauren covered a little earlier on is the quote unquote remix step of preparing open educational resources. So when we started working on Colibri and when we build partnerships and relationships to encourage people to add content to the platform or to look through the materials that we already have in our public library, we do encourage them as much as possible through our tools, but also through the advocacy work that we do to engage in this remix step of working with the educational resources as much as possible. And the reason is that we really believe that skipping this step, we've seen in user research, we've seen in informal feedback, we've seen in receptions from institutional stakeholders like ministries and others, when the remix step is skipped, it can result in a perception of digital repositories and of OER in particular as time-consuming, non-relevant, and overwhelming, because there is a tendency to compare any new OER to the textbook, which has already been contextualized and really adapted to the local curriculum in a way that is easiest for people to use. So without the remix step that's necessary to make these OER materials as easy to use as the textbook, we find that there just isn't able to be the degree of buy-in that can really help these initiatives gain traction. So the type of remix that we're most focused on at Learning Equality is alignment and curriculum alignment in particular. So we have content and content nodes, as Vahid described, a little bit modular, taken from many different places. And then we allow people to engage in a process of vetting the materials that we have in our library, matching them to curriculum standards, and then leveling them appropriately to where they need to be in the curriculum. And this creates a really organized bank of materials for teachers to then engage further in lesson planning. So alignment is probably the most high value type of engagement that we promote with the remix step of OER. But when we work with our collaborators, we also see a lot of other types of remix, including translation, localization, creating different types of assessment, adding their own materials, and doing selective vetting of the materials as well. So basically, the remix step is of great interest to us, and it's something that we're interested in talking more with all of you about as well, to see which types of remix in particular are most useful and relevant for the materials that you work with, or in particular, what barriers you see to people being able to engage in this step. It's so commonly described as one of the 5 R's, but we really want to delve into thinking about what it is about remixing that is challenging or that is really high value and high opportunity, and we want to be able to encourage those aspects of it. So with that in mind, here are a few examples of alignment projects here. We recently participated in a really large round of alignment that was funded by UNHCR, as well as a smaller round that was funded by other organizations, including Creative Commons, where we were able to align our library, including some of the sources that you see here, frequent sources of OER, to the country curriculum in 5 different countries here and a variety of subjects and grades, which you can drill down more into, in English, Arabic, and Spanish. And we worked with many stakeholders and consultants who were experts in these areas and who were working in the relevant regions in order to be able to do this. One of whom is on the call, actually, our friend Werner, who worked extensively on the alignment in Chile and in Honduras as well. So essentially, this is a model that we've seen has a lot of traction, where we're able to support those who, through our Colibri Studio tool, are aligning the library to their local curriculum standards. And from there, it's possible to engage a really productive conversation with the national authorities and institutional bodies, such as in Honduras, the Teacher Training Union, in Kenya, the Kenya Institute of Curricular Development, and in Jordan, the Jordanian Ministry of Higher Education. So having these materials aligned really shows a commitment to actually localizing the materials in a tangible way that I think national authorities find to be very useful for their work. So this is a strategy that we've really pursued in order to make, in order to encourage this meaningful type of remixing. A question that we have here, and that's really driven a lot of our work at ELI, is when we as a general OER space and a general OER community recommend best practices for remixing and using OER, are they actually realistic in how much time they ask of implementers and educators? And the conclusion that we've come to in forming our strategy going forward has been that if materials are already remixed to a certain degree before they get to educators, then educators can spend their limited planning time on the aspects of lesson planning that are more engaging than, say, checking if materials are aligned to the curriculum or fixing the vocabulary to ensure that it corresponds to the textbook. So that's why, as an institution that, or as an organization that works with content, our goal is really to build partnerships and to encourage community collaboration such that as much of that remixing can be done as possible before it does get to the educators who need to use it. And this is a reflection that we really find interesting to share with others in the OER space, and would be interested in hearing your reflections as well, because we know that OER and the entire philosophy of remixing it definitely comes from the higher education space, where professors, for instance, who were using OER had a lot of potential to remix resources and do a lot of detailed lesson planning that educators in K-12 spaces don't always have the time or the agency and approval from their school districts to be able to do, especially in non-US settings. So we're really interested in seeing how this precept of remixing, which comes from the higher ed space, can be practical and usable for K-12 educators. So with that in mind, these were the questions that we were eager to hear from you about today. The first one being, when you're looking at particular materials or particular content sources, or if you don't evaluate them yourselves, if you're engaging with someone else, we hear a lot about these materials being relevant for particular settings. So we wanted to know more about how you decide whether materials are relevant or not, and if there are any particular considerations you use, heuristics, methods of evaluation. All of that would be interested to know more about in this discussion.
Well, thanks, Shivi, Vahid, and Lauren. Just a terrific overview, which I think of as an appetizer for all the great work that you guys have done. I see some questions have been dropped in the chat as well. I have a few questions, but let's just start with some questions that people have posed, including those, Shivi, that you just concluded with. Folks, as an eCafe, again, just imagine that you're sitting in a comfortable cafe and you've just heard from these three terrific presenters. And as you know, mEducation Alliance event, it's all about networking and participation. So we'd invite folks to let us know by just jumping on and asking a particular question or putting it in the chat. So let me just pause for a moment and see if folks have any questions that they'd like to ask.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great, Denny. And feel free to just introduce yourself as well. I'd love to hear from you.
Okay. Well, you can see on your screen, I'm Denny Bauman. I'm the founder of a little charitable operation called Bethel Computers for Education. And we've donated, I don't know, we're getting close to 5,000 now, computers to poor schools around the world, okay? Africa, Nepal, Asia, South America, Mexico. But our biggest effort has been in Haiti, okay? And I would say more than half of those computers have gone to schools all over Haiti. That's kind of the foundation here. We typically in a school will have something in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 computers in a computer lab and one server that we've created that we call Internet in a Box, okay? And then of course server feeds all the computers, okay? You guys understand that stuff. On that server, we are really big fans, and you can underline that 200 times if you'd like. We're really big fans of Calibri, okay? Even before Calibri came out, we were big fans of Khan Academy, okay? And now the KA Lite version. But the other thing that is really neat about Calibri is the fact that we can run it on a Linux-based server and meet all of this need, and it just does fantastic, okay? But it's not perfect, and you guys know that too, okay? And some of the concerns that I would just like to voice that maybe you guys could comment on maybe. One is that I certainly understand that one of your big challenges is in the area of translations, okay? And you probably have limited, if any, control over that, okay? But they're really important, not only translations for the content itself, but translations for the users' guides and facilitator guides that you guys were talking about a little while ago. All of that stuff. If all of those how to do it documents aren't in the right language, then the content itself is useless, okay? So we're working on that. Right now, we're really interested in the FETs from the University of Colorado, okay? They're fantastic. I don't know, for example, what the total number of FETs is on Calibri right now. I'm thinking it's 130 some, okay? But out of that number, 89 of them are in HTML5 format, okay? And that's what we need to run on our server, okay? Well, that's not a bad number either, okay? But out of that number, none of them were in Haitian Creole, okay? Well, I'm working with a Haitian friend of mine, Mario, and Mario has already translated 47 of them, and we're about to finish another 20 or so. But the end result is that within the next month, within the next 30 days, I think we're going to have all 89 HTML5 format FETs translated to Creole. All right. So my concern is a couple of them. One
Hey, Denny, I was going to say if you could limit it just to maybe one question, and then we could come back or post your other questions. So
okay.
Translations I've heard.
Yeah.
Translations I've heard is a topic. Something beyond translations?
Yeah, it's going to be the availability of the translated FETs when the next update comes out to Calibri. Are we going to have, will we have access to those when you guys put out your next update to Calibri? That's the simple question.
Thank you, Denny. That's terrific to start off with. Lauren, Shivi, and Vahid, I thought maybe we'll take a few questions and then we'll do another round. So Denny, great to begin with in terms of specific general question about translation and then specifically for the next release. I see that Mark had asked a question in the chat to Vahid, is the platform catching users' behavior on the platform while using it offline? So Vahid, that's to you. And then Lauren, Vahid or Shivi, if you see any other questions in the chat as well, maybe why don't we just start with those two and invite other folks to drop questions in the chat as well. So over to you guys, learning quality folks.
Yeah, fantastic questions. And Denny, it's so nice to meet you. I know we've been in email communication in the past with our team. So I'll respond to the other question first, if that's okay. So I think Vahid showed on the visual, but Colibri collects all learner interaction data on the server locally. And so how that is then presented to the coaches is through our coach dashboard. So not everything in its native form is obviously presented, but we've developed these coach dashboards to be able to support personalized and differentiated learning. Typically, what we find in learning platforms that have been designed for online first is that when you move those platforms to offline without the internet, you lose that functionality to be able to track learner progress. Because we've designed for offline first, that's all built in from the outset. So we're not tracking all user behaviors, particularly those that happen outside of the platform, because that's not tracked by the technology, but any kind of interaction with content, whether a hint is used on a quiz, how many attempts are used in an exercise, all of that is tracked in the platform. And if a device is connected over the local area network, again, not on the internet, but through some kind of network, an educator can track that learner progress in real time. But admittedly, there are some current limitations. So kind of where we're heading, there's two things. One is we're moving towards supporting XAPI. And what that will enable us to do is to be able to store interactions within interactive apps, particularly HTML5 and the HTML5 outputs of H5P. So what we're working towards is also having that also be viewable in this dashboard as tracking learner interactions. And I think we could talk, I'm not super technical, but we could talk more about that separately. I think that's really exciting. And I think XAPI integration is something that often also isn't supported in offline learning platforms. The other is that we're moving towards the question and test interoperability standard to be able to expand the type of assessments types that we offer. And for that, I can envision in the future where user behavior kind of outside of the platform could be captured by a learner on their own or by an educator through different types of assessment modalities that would then be able to capture that information. So I hope that gives you some sense of what that looks like. But I just to again underscore, because we've designed for offline first, we're really thinking more about how do we make available the kinds of resources and tools to educators that would be available in an online platform to those without the internet. And that's the use case that we're always designing for. In response to Denny's two questions, I think there's kind of two parts as Tony outlined. The first around translation. So yes, Denny, we very much agree with you that it's really important to ensure that not only that we have content available in the language of instruction or local language, depending upon what the context is, but that the user interface is available in a relevant language. So maybe if the language of instruction is not the mother tongue language, having the interface at least in mother tongue is really helpful to a learner. And then the additional part is around our toolkit of educator support materials and those for implementing organizations, as well as our technical documentation. So in 2021, I forget what year this is for a second, and a little bit into last year, we really took a large effort to make sure that we could start translating all of that documentation into more languages. I think, lessons that we've learned, like from watching Khan Academy, for example, is that translation is challenging when any edit is made to the content, right? So we wanted to make sure that our toolkit was fully tested in a really stable space before we went through a complete comprehensive translation, because the upkeep otherwise could be a bit untenable. So presently we have our toolkit translated into 4 languages completely. Our Colibri Studio interface is translated into 4 languages, probably adding a 5th soon. And again, on the toolkit, we're also expanding quite a bit. The user interface for Colibri is available in 23 languages. And that work is ongoing. We really do depend on the goodwill of some translators to support us with that. And it does require quite a lot of time commitment. And I know in the past we've talked with you all about having a Creole translator, a volunteer translator, and we should reconnect to see what's possible. But like all of that, the documentation is there so that volunteers can support this work. And we work with a corporate in supporting this through their volunteer program. And then we also do quite a lot of work with Translators Without Borders, which is just rebranded, as well as Data Kalam, which supports refugee translators. So for us, like this component is quite critical. We very much agree with what you're saying. And I hope you can kind of see how we're continuing to evolve and make sure that we're expanding the number of languages that we support, as well as have clear documentation for anyone else who wants to contribute to that, to support building out our ecosystem, which is really important for us. In terms of your question around content, I'll just say, and you have the right folks on this call because Shivi and Vahid lead our content import process and pipeline evaluation. And that's always based on an evaluation of needs for our particular partners so that they can continue implementing Colibri at scale, as well as what we're hearing from the global community, and then building out a comprehensive library, which my colleagues can share more about what that looks like. I think last year, we pulled a few dozen sources into our library, and we can share, I think we have a blog kind of summarizing some of that in the chat. And then we've updated existing sets of content like FET. I don't know if we've updated FET, but we've updated other existing channels. I don't know that one offhand. So, so I think like it's super helpful to know that this is a priority for you. We are, building capacity so that we could do more import, but I think at the same time, we always welcome contributions from the community, recognizing that, our team is really focused on continuing to build out our ecosystem and supporting those needs, but we're still also very much a nonprofit and recognizing our capacity. So I hope that answers your question, but we obviously similarly think FET is an incredible source. We've seen its effectiveness globally through our partner interactions and on our site visits of our own. And I think we're hopeful to see how we can leverage the translations that you mentioned, and look forward being in touch for when they're completed to see how we can talk to Vahid and slot that into our pipeline when the timing makes sense, kind of mapped against our other capacities. I hope that answers questions. Yeah.
Can I just a real short response? Thank you for that, Lauren, and maybe more Vahid more because he's the import guy. We're working with Dr. Kathy Perkins at the University of Colorado, who, as you know, is the manager of the FETs. And she's really eager for us to get all 89 of those HTML5 FETs translated into Creole. And like I say, we're going to do it. It'll be done. It's almost done now. So I just want to be sure that it gets imported into Colibri, because Colibri is just such a fantastic tool, and it works so well on our server that we want to make it available when we send out the new version of our server. Okay, thank you, appreciate that.
Great. Denny, thanks so much for that question, and Lauren for your feedback as well. Terrific. I see that Robert has asked a specific question in regards to a bank publication. Robert, do you want to come on for just a moment, or even just your audio? Be really succinct about where you see the connective fiber between what you just heard about learning equality in that particular report. And keep it really concise. We'll have a chance to have learning equality respond, but over to you, Robert.
Yeah, I just brought that report up because there were a bunch of Latin American folks that got together and talked about the big crisis in Latin America as far as education is concerned, and the issue, especially in rural areas, of connectivity and trying to make those connections. And the World Bank put out the publication in, I think it was in December. And so I was just wondering if you guys were familiar with the publication and the 5 principles that it talks about, and maybe you could expound about how it very integrates those 5 points.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Robert, for that question. Lauren, over to you. And then I have another question for you, but go ahead.
Fantastic. Yeah. So Robert, thank you for your question. And thanks for reminding us of this report. I think, yeah, we are familiar with it, and we saw it when it came out. I think, we've been working on Colibri now. It's been released for 3.5 years, and we were working on it for years prior, and also with our first product, K-Lite. But I think we were excited by the comprehensiveness of the 4 principles. And I'll just quickly go through kind of how we've thought about them through our work and kind of how it's linked. And for those who don't know, I think the link that Tony shared will take you directly to it. So the first is around asking why. And I outlined the 4 questions that we often think about when working with organizations at scale, particularly government. But the why is quite critical. And, we like, as an organization, taking a human-centered and needs-based approach to developing our technology is incredibly important. We often get a lot of requests for features or things that people want. And we then kind of flip that around and understand what the underlying needs are. Because we're designing something that can be adaptable for open use and adaptable use, we want to make sure that we're always being niche driven. So understanding that why is important. I think you won't hear anyone on our team say that ed tech or technology is a silver bullet. We know that it takes people and trained and qualified folks to really support learning, but we do see that education technology can play a key role. So asking this why is important. In terms of designing and acting at scale, part of the reasons that we have partners is because we aim to co-design with beneficiaries or receive as much feedback from our community as possible. And admittedly, we could always be doing a lot more of this, and COVID has really limited our ability to do this. And I'm excited to see more conversations around ed tech sandboxes and exactly what that looks like during COVID. But this has always been kind of our underlying approach. The third is on empowering teachers. And I would say that most of the work that we do at Learning Equality is really how do we best support educators? While the learning platform itself provides access to educational content, and my colleagues can share more, a lot of what we do with our toolkit and the coach dashboards that I mentioned is really around how do we best support facilitators. They don't necessarily need to be teachers. They could be coaches or others, mentors that really support learning. And engaging the ecosystem, Shivi mentioned about how we've worked with curricular bodies. We have worked with other ministries of education. We're not direct implementers ourselves. So our approach always is to engage the ecosystem, because we need to ensure that we're working with content creators and implementers, hardware providers, ministries of education, schools, teachers, and other groups. And so for us, we take a fairly holistic approach. And where we've been kind of limited in terms of working with government is often we find that we're somewhat pigeonholed into folks that focus on ICT. And we like to take a really holistic approach and also working with those that focus on curriculum and assessment. So that's something that we also strongly advocate for. And the last is around being data driven. And I mentioned about data before. I should also say that we are piloting a new product that is the only non-open part of our ecosystem called the Colibri Data Portal that will be available to users likely next year. And that is really designed for the collection and reporting and visualization of learner data for scale implementations of Colibri. So we currently have baked in functionality to be able to aggregate data between different installations of Colibri, and then being able to sync those different facilities to this online data portal will allow for organizations and particularly governments to make more data-driven decision-making. So yes, we thought these principles were fantastic. And I'll turn over to my colleagues in case there's other thoughts that they'd like to share that I may have missed.
I'll just go ahead, Shivi.
No, go ahead, Wade.
Just to really reinforce the idea of empowering teachers, our solution was since the beginning designed around the work of the teachers or educators, coaches, facilitators, or education mentors, if you want. And this is a very important role, and we don't think that EdTech in any way can replace the value that a teacher brings to the classroom. So that's central in the design. But at the same time, the pandemic has shown us that sometimes the students can't have access to their teachers. And so we also need to design with that possibility in mind. Sometimes the students just don't have access to a teacher, and then the question becomes, what can we offer them, right? So I just wanted to mention that.
I wanted to give a short note on the empowering teachers bullet as well. Looks like that's a popular one for us. I wanted to say, with regards to content in particular, one thing that's been a big mindset shift for me in working with our content library has been moving away from an approach to empowering teachers, which is unfortunately very common in our ed tech space, which is an attitude of there's something the teachers don't have and we need to give it to them in terms of skills, in terms of training, in terms of capacity. So there's almost an implication which is a little bit patronizing or demeaning that we can see in our space a lot of the time, that teachers don't have what they need in order to make use of OER and in order to make use of it with skills to act upon the pedagogies required. But what we've seen in our work and what we've really tried to compensate for is the fact that it's not often a question of skills or capacity. It's a question of time and resources. So the reason that alignment is such a big focus of our work is because we've seen that when you're working with teachers who are some of the most under-resourced teachers in the world, they're extremely resourceful. The capacity is there, the skills are there. The training does not need to be about improving their practice at teachers, which they have in spades, more so than many of us who have been fortunate to teach in more well-resourced settings. But what they don't have, and what we find to be the most meaningful definition of empowerment, is saving their time, enabling them to, when they take the content that we're offering, enabling them to make a case to their leaders and to their administrators and to those they're accountable to about how it matches with the curriculum and with their constraints, and saving the amount of capacity that it takes to do lesson planning during the pandemic in particular. So when it comes to content, we're sometimes asked, well, we see a lot of pressure, especially in the space, to measure the success of content by how much content you can bring in. You know, we have X amount of sources, we have X amount of people who are clicking on content and things like that. But if we're designing for a low resource context, what we really want to invite people to do, and what we try to introspect and do on our own, is to think not only about how much there is, but is it really doing things that are meaningful to empower teachers in a way that goes past just surface level discussions? If there is content in the library, does it have assessments? Is it organized in a way that is understandable? Does it have appropriate linguistic connections? Is it labeled by age and grade, localized to the particular area rather than just blanket categorizations? So that is a part of content that I think fits with the empowering teachers area, which looks different than a lot of conversations that we see in the space, and that I know that I've been trying to develop my thinking towards, and that our team has as well.
Terrific, Shivi. Shivi, maybe for the three of you, a meso level question and then a micro level question, and then we can see if there's any sort of wrap up questions. Let's start with the micro. Is Shivi, when you talked about the remixing in the countries, you mentioned the 5 countries or so, could you give us a specific example of a subject? And then is there a particular subject that you find consistently is the most popular? That would be sort of the micro level. And the meso level, in light of COVID-19, what have you seen in terms of the expansion or use, or this is to any of you, and just in terms of the uptake of Colibri and the work that you're doing, just in terms of obviously what's going on. So a micro and then a meso level.
Sure, I could take that, the question about the alignment and subject popularity. So I would be curious to hear if this experience is shared by others who also work with alignment initiatives. But our experience has definitely been that math is the most popular subject for alignment initiatives, to the point that it can actually impede a lot of other initiatives because practices that work for aligning math content to a curriculum sometimes don't transfer over into other subject areas. My training comes from the social sciences and humanities, and what alignment would look like is completely different than organizing things into the sequential order that's often utilized when we align math and science content. But it is definitely for those who are thinking about how they can use alignment to add value in a particular OER intervention. I think that most people would recommend that math and science is probably the best place to start because it helps people get familiar with the alignment process on a really large scale. We worked mostly in the countries that we did with math, science, and life skills material. And definitely the life skills processes for alignment and remixing were the most idiosyncratic. So we think there is a lot to be done to make this process easier and to build capacity in a way that respects the intricacies of these subjects, rather than making the assumption that remixing works the same way in all the subjects. So it's a great question. I'm glad you asked.
And then it does look like, just in the interest of allowing sort of my question, I'll put on the side for now, because I see that our colleague from Pratham, Annapurni, has posted a question about the curation process. Maybe Shivi, one of you could take a look at that.
Sure, so I can. Hi, Annapurni, it's good to see you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we're
huge fans of Colibri, and it's great to be a part of this session. And I think it was very useful to hear about the remixing process. I just felt that you were working in such diverse areas, and especially coming from a country like India where language changes every 100 kilometers, we feel that we're in constant need to curate and create content because something that's relevant in the north of India is not relevant in the south of India, even visually. So that's something that we face as a challenge, and hence I wanted to know your experience with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that you really put your finger in your question on the content library, what we see as kind of the big, massive paradox of curating a library like this, which is a trade-off, or one could say a tension between relevance and between scale. So I think that the idea that OER will always travel far is something that we have different opinions about across our team, as well as honestly on any given day when we're looking at different initiatives. So I think that the way that we've answered this question in our curation process is, rather than trying to strike a perfect balance between relevance and scale, we will try to provide as wide a net as possible to include any possible materials that we can in our library. And then we'll design tools and encourage, through the initiatives that we do, such as alignment and such as targeted localization with partners and collaborators, we will encourage them to be the ones who can select the relevant content, match it to the age group, evaluate the appropriateness of the language, etc. Because this is something that curators of a global library, they probably should not be doing, we think, in terms of evaluating whether something is relevant and appropriate or not. That is really something that can only be done by those in the relevant settings and contexts. So our goal is, less to strike the balance and more to err on the side of scale, and then produce as many tools, concrete tools, and pursue as many strategic partnerships as we can to ensure that that scale is broken down when it makes it to implementations in a reasonable way.
If I may add to this, it's also important to indicate that while Colibri offers a library of publicly available content, any institution, organization, even a single teacher can upload their own contents and make use of those contents. So the users of Colibri are not limited to the library we provide. Rather, they can upload their own content and make their own adjustments to their own needs.
Thanks, Fahid and Shivi. Great response to the question. Anapurni, great that you're joining us from India. I just dropped in the chat. What we really like about the eCafes is how diverse our audience is from around the world. And isn't it simply amazing that we're able to have this, this dialogue? So I wanted to invite folks to turn on their camera. If we got to this point in the discussion, then if we turn on the camera and it ends, we'll still have had a successful eCafe. And just want to thank everybody for joining us as well. Please let us know in the chat what countries that you're calling in from. That sort of dates myself when I call calling in, whatever. But and sure, if we have additional questions for Lauren, Shivi, or Vahid, we'll direct those to you. I am excited to know that we've been working closely with Learning Equality on our upcoming issue of our EdTech Connected e-zine that will be specifically focused on OERs. And so take a look at our website to see what the previous EdTech Connecteds have looked like. And as I mentioned, we'll be focusing on OERs, including as part of our symposia that's taking place in September. So another plug in regards to disseminating the call for presentation proposals or submitting it. I'm going to do a final thank you for folks. But before we do that, Scott Nicholson, give us a quick 30-second to a minute preview of what your eCafe is going to be about at the end of this month or at the end of July.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. So I've been working with designing escape rooms for education for 5 or 6 years now. And while it's a great way to get learners to engage with the topic, it's also very resource intensive. When I presented at the mEducation Alliance conference last year, 20 years ago, who knows, with the pandemic, that came up. This issue of having to have locks and boxes and paper and all of this creates a barrier to using this kind of learning in low resource classrooms. So I have a sabbatical starting tomorrow, and over the year, I'm going to be thinking about how to make escape games for low resource classrooms. So what I'm going to talk about at the end of the month are my initial thoughts to get some feedback on, is this the right path? The goal would be to have a toolkit and sample games that teachers can use to run games in classrooms that have nothing more than a chalkboard, found objects, and eager learners.
Thank you, Scott. And we're thrilled you'll be working with us on that as part of the mEducation Alliance here sabbatical. All right, what about a round of applause for our colleagues from Learning Equality, or however we do that, there you go, jazz hands. And Lauren, Shivi, and Vahid, you guys have been amazing. I think we met at one of the early symposia and consistently have been a presence. And we've been really excited as the mEducation Alliance to be able to deepen our relationship with your great work. So look forward to your continuing your great work and how we can help amplify your efforts. I want to thank everybody for joining us today from wherever you are. And if you, again, don't already subscribe, please subscribe to our e-news, then you'll get announcements about upcoming events. Without further ado, wanted to thank everybody and wish you a pleasant, probably good afternoon or good evening at this point. But if there are those that are celebrating their morning and haven't had breakfast, greetings to you as well. So thank you everyone for joining us for this edition of our mEducation Alliance eCafe, and have a great day.